Oh, sure, yes, sure. Yeah, first it was piping hot. Oh, okay, thank you.
Okay, now that you've all gotten something to satisfy your sweet tooth, we're going to begin our presentation. I have the honor of introducing Miss Erin Murray, resident here in Merrimack, who has been doing yeoman's work to improve the reputation of our community. She is the captain on the Granite State Challenge team that recently has been applauded for winning 3 years in a row. We've got the smartest kids in New Hampshire. We hope to build on that. Her school life is busy, her home life is busy with all of her participation in her family and the community things, not the least of which is an ELO that she performed for us, and this is the culmination of it this evening, and we are grateful for knowing you, working with you, and we're happy to be here this evening. So, Erin, take it away.
All right. So the ELO that I chose to do is a brief history of canal boats. So this is something that I didn't know existed until I started working and speaking with people who are here, and it's a very, very Merrimack-tied piece of history that is often forgotten about. So I decided to look more into it and to create a physical representation of what a canal boat would have looked like so that people in the future can also learn about it as well. So we can go to the next one. So this presentation is going to be mostly 4 parts. What are canal boats? What is the timeline? Like, when were they used? Like, the big questions. Who, what, when, where, why, how. And then the Merrimack connection. How does this connect to Merrimack specifically? So we'll start with what are canal boats. So canal boats are a specific method of transportation that were very important during the Industrial Revolution. And so they basically used the Merrimack River, the Middlesex Canal, and the Charles River to transport goods all the way up from like northern New Hampshire down to Boston. So before then, transporting over land was really, really costly, and it took a very long time. But using canal boats, the trip was only about 3 days. So it was way faster, and they could bring a lot down the canal. So basically they did everything that railroads would do now before the railroads were put in place. So this is a quote from Henry David Thoreau. The canal boat is a very simple construction, requiring but little ship timber, as we were told, costs about $200. So they were very cost effective, very easy to make, and incredibly efficient compared to using the regular roads. It was basically the ideal transport at the time. This picture is a painting that was in the UMass Lowell archives depicting a boat on the canal traveling in front of the Baldwin estate. We'll actually hear a little bit more about the Baldwins later, but basically he was very involved with the Middlesex Canal. So the specifics of the actual boat. So because of the constraints of the Middlesex Canal, which is the connecting canal between the 2 rivers which allowed transport to Boston, the actual boats, called scows, had very limited construction. They were incredibly regulated so that they could both fit through the canal and the lock system that allowed them to travel up and down the river. They could be between 45 and 75 feet in length, 9 and 9.5 feet wide, and they had to be very flat, shallow boats, as you can see in the image. They're often flat-bottomed or very slightly angled so that they had a big surface area, because the Middlesex Canal at its deepest was only around 3 or 4 feet. So even though they were carrying tons and tons of bricks and barrels and wood, they couldn't sink very low into the water or they would scrape along the bottom of the canal and wouldn't be viable. timeline of canal boating. Very short. There was not very long of a period of time that this was the most effective transport. So the beginning was between 1793, when the Middlesex Canal Corporation was founded, to 1807, when the first lock was created on the Merrimack River. This was the period of time that they created the Middlesex Canal, allowing for transport between Boston and Concord, and continuing to open up the Merrimack River. But the problem was the Merrimack River is full of a lot of falls and rocks and rapids that is really, really damaging for a very shallow boat. So it means that they couldn't really get all the way up as they needed to. So they started creating locks. Then in the next part, at 1816, all of the locks on the Merrimack River were completed. So between 1807 and 1816, just 9 years, they put all of the locks in place. And then between 1816, when the locks were put in place, to 1819, when 8 million bricks were transported in 1 year from Bedford using the canal and the river, things picked up really fast. Really, really fast. It went from a small thing that could go a little bit farther and a little bit down the river to being a complete system from Concord to Boston in only a few short years. And so this was picking up really, really fast. And so in 1820, packet boats with passengers traveled, and in the 1830s, the canals were actually so effective that they started to build their competition. So the canal boats were used to transport rail ties and the rail beams that would later replace them. Because later when the railroad opened, they would be completely replaced. And that's actually in the next slide. So the end of canal boating came very fast as well. In 1838, the railroad from Boston to Lowell was completed, and it cut profits on the canal by 1/3. In 1839, Henry David Thoreau travels down the river and writes about it in his first book. But he also depicts that the locks are already in disrepair, and some of them are not manned, meaning that in that one short year where the railroad is completed to the next year, people don't take care of the locks, and they've already started to deteriorate. Things kind of fell out just as fast as they grew. In 1852, the last boat travels through the canal. And while some may travel up and down the river, no more use the canal as it is. And while it remained open until 1860, it was no longer used. The railroad was more efficient, it was faster, and it was far cheaper to use than the canal boats, which could only take a limited amount of supplies, and it took 3 days, as opposed to the railroad, which took much faster. And so, the most important years are 1816, 1838, and 1852. The peak of the railroad the peak of the canals were around 1816. All of the locks were created. Every fall was overcome, and it was the most effective transport until 1838, when the railroad was created. And this became the beginning of the end. They started going downhill with less and less profits every year. And 1852 became the last year that a canal boat traveled through the Merrimack Canal. The Middlesex Canal, sorry. Next is the big questions. So, the big questions are who, what, and how. So, who was involved in both the canal and the river? Who lived there? Who worked there? Who created this? Whose idea was this? What? What went down the river? What went back up the river? I know I'm saying that it was very important, but what was actually moved? How could they do it? What was it like to travel along the canal? How did the people in the boats live their lives? So let's start with who. James Sullivan, Noami Baldwin, Isaac Riddle, and Henry David Thoreau. So James Sullivan and Noami Baldwin were the two main creators of the Middlesex Canal. They were the two original founders and the engineer and president of the Middlesex Canal Corporation. They were the ones who built it, planned it, funded it, did everything for it. And I don't have too much information on them because I tried to focus more on the actual Merrimack River aspect. So that's where Isaac Riddle is. Riddle's Tavern is somewhere that you all probably know of as Buckley's Steakhouse. So it's a historical building in town that is still being used. And when it was originally built, it was built as a tavern and an inn for people traveling up and down the Merrimack River on these canal boats. And so Isaac Riddle was heavily involved with the creation of this whole system, the locks and the canals. And I tried to learn more about it because I went to the UMass Lowell archives and tried to read their actual documents. They have so many documents. They have about 50 boxes filled with file folder after file folder of notes and letters and documents like that. And a lot of them were letters from Isaac Riddle to people like James Sullivan and Lauren Baldwin. But the problem is, Isaac Riddle has terrible handwriting. Truly, truly atrocious. I can read cursive, and I was reading some of these other letters. I got to Isaac Riddle's, and I was like, what? I had no clue. So there's a little bit of a gap there where I don't know exactly what he was doing with them, and there were some other resources that I probably should have looked into, but straight up reading his letters was unmanageable for me. But Henry David Thoreau is someone that you have also probably heard of. He is a transcendentalist writer based in New England who wrote many, many things that are very well known to this day. And Thoreau is actually how I got a lot of the specific information about the look of the boatmen in this painting. So he talked about, he took a trip with his brother from his hometown all the way up to the top of the Merrimack River. And so he wrote about people that he passed along the way. He wrote about the boatmen in the canal boats traveling up and down the river. And he wrote about how they often didn't wear hats or shoes, and they did things in a certain way, and they would do things that were a little outside the norm. And so that was described really well in his novel, and so I got to paint it. Next is what? So downriver would be a lot of building materials, natural resources, and agriculture. So up in New Hampshire, we would grow foods or cut down trees and get gravel and stone and granite, and especially bricks. We would travel bricks downriver. But another important thing is lumber. So there were tons and tons of forests in New Hampshire, and there obviously still are. So lumber was a huge export. But the thing about lumber is that it already floats, so you don't always have to put it in a boat. So what they would do is they would cut down the trees, and then they would bind it together into what was called a shot, which is the same dimensions as the canal boats, and they would be rafted downstream to try and save money. Because if the water was high and you had these shots, you could just go over the falls. They didn't have to go through the locks, and they didn't have to pay the tolls on the locks that you would have to pay if you were taking it down in a boat. So it was both more efficient that you didn't have to pay for a boat, but you also didn't have to pay for the tolls. So that's a lot of what they would do when it was in the spring and the water was very high. It was a little easier to get over those falls. And it was very scary, but at times it was very lucrative. But one of the most important things here is clay and fire bricks. So bricks, because Merrimack and Bedford and our whole area has a lot of clay-rich soil, bricks were one of our main exports. Almost all of Lowell is built from bricks in this area. They would be traveled down the river in these boats, just as it's depicted in the painting, and we'll see a little closer up here later. The bricks were incredibly special. So as farmers were tilling, or if they had a bit of land that they weren't using, they would use that clay and they would build bricks, and it was almost like a side hustle for farmers while they were waiting for their crops to. And so actually, in the next slide you can see, I mentioned earlier, 8 million bricks in 1 year were traveled out of Bedford down the Merrimack River. This is actually noted in Henry David Thoreau's novel, and it's truly a feat. Like, it's 8 million bricks using only these boats is pretty insane. But it definitely made a lot of money for all of the farmers and all of the people in the area. But what came back up the river? So upriver was finished goods, raw materials that we couldn't get up here, and news. Finished goods included beer and rum, glass, and then raw materials like iron and pig iron, coal or charcoal. But what was really special was the travel of news. Nowadays, you can just look on your phone, look through all the articles, and see what's happening pretty much everywhere in the world. But before that, you could get a letter in the mail if something was super important for someone to tell you. You could wait for your friend to come up the road, or as all of these boatsmen were stopping at every inn, they would tell news from Boston. Who was just elected? Who was speaking? What's going on in Boston? Or even, what are they wearing in Boston? What's the newest trend? What are they doing there? News was something that was hard to get, but this made it a little easy. And so all along the river, wherever men would stop and stay for the night, that's where you would find news. And that's something that was incredibly important at the time. And that made the people traveling up and down incredibly important to where they were staying. So if you were driving that boat and you had that news, you're a little cooler than everybody else at the inn because you knew what was happening. And so next thing is how. So how included the lock system. So locks are what they would use to get over the falls. The locks, as you can see in the picture, they would drive into this little concrete area, and these were very specific dimensions, which is another reason why they had to have the boats in very specific dimensions. But they would either fill up or drain to let you up or down the falls. The next slide actually shows a very effective diagram that I got to see while at UMass Lowell. So what you can see here is these two huge mitered gates. And what would happen was you would let yourself in with the gates. If you were going downriver, so the falls would be going down and you would be trying to sink down a lower level, the lock would be all the way up the falls. And so you would let yourself in the closest gate to you and then close the door farthest. But it has what's called a butterfly gate right here. And there's a small handle at the top. So they would slowly turn that gate and let the water out slowly, lowering your boat down to the level of the water at the bottom of the falls. And the same would be done in the opposite. If you were trying to go up the falls, you would open the door closest to you, let yourself in, and slowly let it fill up until you were the level of the height of the falls. So that way, you didn't have to try and get out of the water and tow your boat around the falls and try and get back in after dragging your boat full of bricks. Nobody really wants to drag a boat full of bricks. So this way they could stay in the water and effectively and not damaging the boat or the materials in the boat, travel up and down past falls and rapids. Next, how did the boatmen live? If you were on this boat, what happens? I know we talked about inns and stuff, but a really cool thing that would happen was they had small horns on these things, and they would blow the horns about a mile away or so to indicate both how many people and how they were arriving. And so, by the time they got to the inn, they would have hot food on the table for these people already. So it means that even if you were coming from far away, if you blew that horn and the innkeeper heard it, they would prep you some food, and you would just pay when you were there. Perfectly easy, and it meant that you didn't have to wait for a half an hour for your dinner if you were just boating all day. Next is the Merrimack connection. I know it's a little unclear right now, but you can see some pieces of it, but this is where my painting comes in. So, my painting displays a few connections to Merrimack specifically. First is that it depicts Depot Street. So if you go to the next slide, you can see pictures of the Depot Street boat ramp. So that's actually just at the end of the road here. And that was used as a landing point for people in these boats so they could go up to Riddle's Tavern and other areas nearby. So basically they would stop there, tie up their boats for the night, and come up and get food and water and whatever they needed. There are actually, in the painting, some small rocks. You can see one on the right side. You go to the previous slide, actually. So, over on this side, that rock, this little bit there, would have on the side of it a small metal hitch where they would tie up the boats. And actually down on Depot Street there are two large rocks with little metal loops where they would tie up the boats. And so if we go to the slide, 2 slides. Yep. The next thing is the bricks. We talked about bricks already and how they were a super major export from this area, but specifically in this painting, they're taking bricks downstream to Boston. And there is a slight mistake in the painting at this point, because I actually made them facing the wrong way. Because if they were taking bricks down to Boston, coming out of Depot Street, the path should be on the other side of the river. But nobody's really gonna know that, so that's okay. But the bricks were a huge export, so they could travel up to like 2 or 3 tons of bricks in one boat at a time. And they would use these poles that you can see here, long poles with an iron cover, to push themselves up or down the river, because the sides of the river are quite shallow compared to the large, like, current in the center of the river. So they would push themselves along the sides, and so they could carry those huge, heavy bricks. Also, because they were fairly shallow, they had a lot of buoyancy helping them out. And the last slide, or not the last slide, but the next slide shows the boatman. So at the time, when you were outside, you wore shoes, still a thing, but you also wore a hat. Men almost never went outside without a hat. It was like impolite. But because these boatmen were working outside all day, using their hands to push and doing all of that, sometimes they found that the fashionable hats of the era got in the way. And so this was described a lot in Thoreau's novel, A Week Unconquered in Merrimack Rivers, that the boatmen didn't wear anything that got in their way. So if it got in the way while you were traveling up and down the river, if the wind on the river is going to blow your hat off, why would you wear a hat? So they wouldn't even wear shoes sometimes. So I actually depicted in my painting someone not wearing shoes, because that was something a little special about these boatmen that I thought should be included. So anything that got in their way while they were working, they just didn't do, which was new, and it was changing. And some people didn't like it, but, you know, if you're the coolest guy at the tavern with all of your news from Boston, no one's going to tell you that you have to wear a hat. So next is sources and research. So a huge part of this project was learning all this information, and so I had to find a bunch of different sources on how to do that. Most of the original information was actually just a conversation I had with Mr. Muller, and so that gave me the foundation to know where I was looking and how to look, but it also gave me the basic information to start the painting. From there, I filled in all the gaps and backed up all the information with research from other sources. I actually researched at the UMass Lowell Archives, which is where I got a lot of the pictures that you saw. So the UMass Lowell Center for Lowell History has a huge collection of original documents from the building of the Middlesex Canal, including pictures of the letters, including pictures of the boats at times, but very grainy and very far away, but also ledgers of tolls of how much went by, what went by, and how much it would cost to travel a certain item, so we know what went up and what went down and how. And then the next most important thing was A Week on the Concord and Merrimack Rivers. This is the novel by Henry David Thoreau that gave a lot of the specifics on the lifestyle, on how it was to go up and down the river, because he did. And while there is a lot more in that novel that I don't think I processed fully enough, because he is a very philosophical writer, a lot of the more legitimate, like, straight up, there was a man there with no hat, I got that. I did understand that. And so that was really helpful in helping me depict the specifics, but also to learn what life would have been. And finally, the other most important information I got was from a pamphlet. It was a historical pamphlet by Thomas Joy on early canal transportation. It's a very old thing, but I found it there's digital scans online that you can look at, and it was full of information on how the canal started, what did the boats look like, how did it work, and then a lot of information about the end of the canal and how it worked at that point. And so that was by Thomas Joy, and I researched it through, I believe, the Stanford documents on that. And then finally, my other sources are the Middlesex Canal Association, providing high quality maps so I can look at the elevation levels as well as the start and end points. And The other things are the actual sources of where I got some of these documents that I didn't get to see in person, because this is a very well documented thing, but a lot of it's online now. So I had to look at digital scans of the original document or a free online copy of the novels, stuff like that. But a lot of my sources were really cool, and some of them were really hands-on. I was really excited to work with the archivists at UMass Lowell to actually look and to touch and to read the letters of what was happening at the time. So that was really cool. Finally, does anyone have any questions? Yes?
How much were the tolls?
The tolls, well, it depended on what it was. It was somewhere around, it was per ton, and it was like between $5 and $25, somewhere around there. But each item was listed individually, and it would say per ton, or per barrel, or per something, and it would tell you how much money it was. So it varies very specifically based on what items were going up and down.
Thank you.
Yes?
Was there any smuggling that you know of along the river?
If you consider the lumber going over without paying the toll smuggling, there's that. But otherwise, I'm not quite sure, because I think the whole point of smuggling is not getting caught. So there's not a lot of records of those.
What was the name of the Thoreau's book again?
A Week on the Concord and Merrimack Rivers. I believe it is his first book too. So
It's in the Gutenberg Project.
Yes.
Thank you.
Yes.
Do you have a map of where the Middlesex Canal joins the two rivers?
I do, but I don't think I put it in this PowerPoint. But there are some online. The Middlesex Canal Association has a very good map that I looked through.
How about the names of the towns?
The names of the towns, I know at one point it goes through Medford, and it goes through up to Concord and a little bit farther north of that. But off the top of my head, I don't know every town that it went through.
Over to Billerica.
Yes, it did go through Billerica specifically. Any other questions? Yes?
Boats ever get stolen?
Did boats ever get stolen? It was unlikely, because actually how they detailed the boats was, most boats now have like a name, but these boats were specifically the owner of the boat's last name and 1, 2, 3 through however many boats they owned. So what would happen would be the toll would go to that person. So if you stole the boat, it says the real owner's name on the side, so you'd probably get caught pretty quick. Do you have a question?
I was wondering about the ELO program.
Yeah.
Could you elaborate on that?
So the ELO program at the high school is the extended learning program. It's basically like a build your own class system. So what I did was I went to the ELO coordinator and decided that I wanted to do an ELO with the Historical Society. And we went through a couple iterations of different projects and what we wanted to do, and we tried a couple different things, but this is what we finally settled on. I knew I wanted it to be historical, and I knew I wanted it to have something to do with painting, because I am going to school for art in the future. And so this was the project that we settled on because it held a nice blend of the two. So what I would do was, this painting was made entirely at the school. I had a 5th period study, and so I would go to the art room where it would stay, and I would work on it day after day. But all the research and stuff that I did with the Historical Society was after school hours on my own free time here. And so this ELO was specifically pass-fail, so I either got the credit or I didn't get the credit, and at the end of the semester, when it was time to finish up the ELOs, I presented this painting and a similar presentation with a much less pretty PowerPoint to my ELO coordinator at the high school, and he decided, yes, this counts for credit, or no, you did not do enough, this does not count for credit. I did get the credit for this one, which is great.
Was it a credit for your high school or?
Yes, it's a high school credit. So it counts as an ELO credit, which is basically like telling the college that I'm going to that I chose to do my own learning as an optional thing. It's almost like a go-getter point. It's like, hey, I did my own thing and I chose to do it. So it looks very nice, but it's a very fun experience to learn in a non-specifically classroom setting. Any other questions? Yes?
What led you to try to take history class through the ELO?
Well, I've taken history classes, but I didn't have one this year. And so, actually, the original plan for the ELO was way different from this. The original plan was that I saw a painting in the high school that I wasn't a huge fan of and wasn't particularly historically sound, and so I came to them to see if they would support me changing it. And they did, and we tried, but the school wasn't particularly on our side. So I decided that I still wanted to work with them, and that I still wanted to do a project with the Historical Society, so we ended up changing course to this. But it originally wasn't as much of a history project like this is, and it was much more of a recreating something else or changing something because it didn't agree with me. And while that didn't happen, I'm really glad that this did happen. Anything else? All right, thank you.
Erin,
Yeah, the bricks.
these are sample bricks that were taken down there at Depot Street.
Yeah.
So these would have been on those canal boats.
Oh, outstanding. You can put them back in the foundation after we made it.
Don't worry, Mark. Oh, yep. And Erin, the society would like to present you with a small token of our appreciation for your painting and your presentation.
Thank you.
Your wonderful presentation.
Did you get another school credit?
Oh, not for this, but I think I could.
Where's the painting going to be displayed?
The painting will stay here. So, I'm not sure where exactly you guys are gonna put it, but it lives with you now, so.
Did you sign it? Our display coordinator will find a good place for that.
Sounds good. And I'm sorry that it doesn't have a frame. It's a little large to get framed in a regular micro, so.
But you did sign it.
I did. It's in the bottom corner right there. It's just a little dark. But,
Excellent. Thank you so much.
of course. Thank you all for having me.
Thank you for coming.
Susan, did you want to, Susan?
Yes?
Did you want to see those references again on the
Oh, I'm
book?
all set.
You're all
I
set?
know where to get them.
Okay.
Thank you.